Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, the map is covered in places most people never think about again. Commuter towns painted to feel wholesome, logging roads the county half forgot, old theater buildings where the lights only come on twice a year. From a distance, they look peaceful. Up close, some of them feel like the forest has been swallowing secrets for decades. Tonight's stories come from those in-between places, where the quiet is just a little too deep. First, a Washington family home that looked perfectly ordinary until detectives found a spiral notebook sitting open on the kitchen counter, the word "Beats" printed at the top in clean block letters. Then, a wellness retreat where a doctor convinced desperate patients that hunger was medicine, signed their own death certificates, and buried them in soil that still doesn't grow right. And finally, a mountain theater town where a quiet stagehand moved through auditions and retirement, parties like fog through a stage set, while bodies turned up in rivers and ravines. Before the stories start, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and which of tonight's locations you'd be least likely to stop your car in at night. Also, YouTube tells me that only about 4% of the people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you're in that other 96%, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps more than you think. It keeps this channel digging up the stories that never should have been buried. Now, turn down the lights. Let's head in. Story 1. I still think about the notebook. Not the bodies, though God knows those stay with you too. Not the courtroom, not the testimony, not the sentencing. The notebook. A small spiral-bound thing, college-ruled, the kind you pick up in a gas station for $1.50. It was sitting open on the kitchen counter like someone had just stepped away from it. And written across the top of the page in clean block letters was one word: beats. That word changed everything I thought I knew about what one human being could do to another. My name is Gemma. No, wait. I always do that. Force of habit, giving people the easy version. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I found in that house in the fall of 2008, in a small commuter town on the northern edge of Washington state. A town that felt like it had been painted by someone who wanted things to look safe. Cedar-sided houses, a main street with a diner and a hardware store, the kind of place where people wave at each other from their driveways and mean it. I'd been with the Major Crimes Unit for 11 years by then. I'd worked homicides that made the news and homicides that never did. I thought I had a pretty solid sense of the shape a crime scene takes, the way violence leaves a room looking, the randomness of it, the mess. This house didn't look like any of that. I got the call at 2 a.m. Dispatch framed it as a welfare check, which already told me something. A real emergency call, a real discovery, doesn't usually get that label. Welfare check is what you say when the details don't fit the category, when the caller is calm in a way that makes you uneasy. I remember pulling up to the house and noticing the patrol lights were already there, washing the cedar siding red and blue in the dark. The neighborhood was quiet. No neighbors on porches, no onlookers yet. Just that house and the light and a phone ringing somewhere inside. Steady and patient, like it hadn't gotten the memo. 2 boys were standing at the edge of the front porch. Not on it, not off it. Right at the threshold, in the narrow band of yellow light from the fixture above the door. Careful. Like they'd decided exactly where to stand. The older one was named Nate, 18 years old. Home from his first semester at a university, about 4 hours away. He had his hands clasped in front of him, and his eyes were dry, which isn't automatically suspicious. Shock does different things to different people, but there was something about the way he was standing, still, composed in a way that looked studied. The other boy was his friend, Cole, also 18, scholarship kid, debate team, theater tech at their high school. Teachers I'd later speak to described him as the kind of student who made you feel like he was deciding whether to like you. One of them used a phrase I wrote down and kept, "He can talk anyone into anything." Said it like a compliment, like she was proud of him. They kept saying the same 3 sentences, rotating between them. "We just got back. We found them. We didn't touch anything." People in shock repeat themselves. I know that. But this had rhythm. This had sequence. They weren't talking over each other or finishing each other's sentences or collapsing into each other the way people do when something terrible has just happened. They were alternating, measured, like a practiced exchange. Inside I found what I'll describe only as the absence of chaos. 3 members of the same family, the father, Randall, 48, the mother, Carla, 44, and the youngest son, Owen, 15, were dead in separate rooms of the house. What struck me, walking through in the first hour, was that nothing in that house looked like a struggle had happened. No knocked-over furniture, no scattered shoes, no evidence that anyone had run or fought or tried to get out. The violence had happened in place. Whoever did it moved through those rooms like they'd already walked them in the dark 100 times. I cleared the scene. I kept the boys outside in separate patrol units, and I went back to the kitchen counter. The notebook was still there. I crouched beside it without touching it and read the page again. Under the word beats were bullet points, short, tidy, lowercase, dinner ends, lights out, witness window, exit. I told myself it was probably nothing. Families have notebooks. Kids write outlines for school. People make lists. I told myself all of that. But I flagged it for photography and bagging, and I went home at 6 in the morning and sat at my kitchen table, staring at those words until the coffee went cold. Witness window. I've been in this job long enough to know that the sentence you can't let go of is usually the one that matters. By the time the sun came up, I had a working portrait of the family. Randall Mercer had run a private diagnostic lab for about 12 years. Careful, methodical, no enemies anyone could name. Carla taught chemistry at the local community college. Colleagues described her as warm and a little overprotective of her kids, in the way parents sometimes are when one of the kids needs more looking after. The younger son, Owen, 15 years old, the one I keep thinking about, was neurodivergent. Sensory sensitivities, rigid routines, a need for quiet and predictability. His school records used the word gentle 3 times across different evaluations. One teacher added literal and anxious, and I knew exactly what she meant. A counselor at his school told me something that I replayed a lot over the following weeks. She said Nate, the older brother, had come to see her once about a month before and had said something that she'd noted down because it bothered her. He said, "I feel like I'm living in someone else's house." She'd flagged it as a stress response, adjustment issues. First semester away, family tension. Normal enough. She didn't know what it actually was. By 9 in the morning, Nate and Cole were at the station. They came in together, sat down together. Their posture was almost identical. Straight-backed, hands on the table, head slightly tilted in the same direction. I noticed it and said nothing. They volunteered their alibi before I asked for it. That alone is not suspicious. People want to get ahead of it. But the way they did it, the amount of detail, the precision of it, that was something else. They'd been to the cinema. A late showing of a Pixar film. The kind of movie that feels like it was chosen for its wholesome remove from anything dark. They named the ticket kiosk. They described the specific side of the lobby they entered from. And then, and this was the part, Nate made a point of saying, almost parenthetically, that they'd sat at a table in the diner afterward that was right under the camera. He said it casually, like it just occurred to him. Truth forgets things. Lies remember them in the right order. I let them finish, and then I did the thing you have to do. I separated them. Put Cole in one room and Nate in another and let them sit for a while with nothing but their own thoughts and the sound of the ventilation system. Then I went in and I asked each of them, separately, one question I hadn't asked yet. "What were you wearing?" Cole answered immediately without hesitating. He described his jacket and his shoes. Then, before I moved on, he asked me something that stopped me cold. "Are you going to take our clothes?" I want you to think about that for a second. Because at that point, at that exact moment, I had not said a single word about blood. I had not said anything about trace evidence. I had not mentioned what forensics were looking for. He asked about their clothes the way you ask about something you've already been thinking about, something you've been waiting to find out. I wrote it down and kept my face completely flat. Over the next 2 days, we pulled everything we could. Cinema ticket logs, security camera footage, staff interviews, done blind, no photos, just descriptions, phone records, location data. And what we found wasn't that their alibi was false. It was worse than that. They were there in a way that looked engineered. They'd bought their tickets at the exact minute the film started, late enough to create a window. We definitely weren't home, but not so late that they'd missed the lobby cameras. On the footage, they appeared briefly, without buying snacks, without lingering, walking in like men who knew exactly where the camera was and how long they needed to be in frame. At the diner, they sat for less than 20 minutes, stiffly, not eating much, long enough for a timestamp, short enough to preserve the window. It wasn't an alibi. It was a receipt. And then the warrant came through for their devices, and I started to understand what I was actually dealing with. Nate had 3 more spiral notebooks in his bedroom. One of them was labeled draft book, in the same block lettering as the one on the kitchen counter. The pages weren't about the family explicitly, but they were filled with the same vocabulary: beats, turns, stakes, audience. One entry referred to the witness segment, and another to the discovery frame. There were timing notes, margin annotations in a different pen, like someone had reviewed the draft and made edits. Cole's laptop had a folder called Drafts. Inside were monologue files that read like a person practicing remorse, not feeling it, practicing it. One file had a note at the top that said, "Too flat, redo from Guilt Beat." Another had a single line that I read about 40 times. "Do it again, but less desperate." They had voice notes, long ones, of themselves critiquing each other. Timing, tone, believability. They used the word believability the way theater coaches use it. They'd film themselves in what they called acting exercises. There were shared documents with story outlines, and there was a recurring thread in their messages, a kind of private mythology they'd built around being exceptional, above ordinary people, above the rules that constrained ordinary people. They called regular people NPCs, which is a video game term for background characters who aren't real, who just exist to populate the world. I'm going to tell you the first horror here, because I think it's important. It's the one people resist the most. These boys did not look like what we want killers to look like. They weren't raging, unhinged, obviously broken. They were smart. They were composed. They had futures that looked from the outside like success, and they decided, together over time, in a way that felt to them like intelligence, that being extraordinary meant being willing to do what ordinary people couldn't. Money was part of it. There was a life insurance policy that had been increased, a refinance in progress, education fund irregularities. Those things mattered, and we documented all of them. But as I read through their messages and their notebooks and their voice notes, I stopped thinking of money as the motive and started thinking of it as the excuse, the practical thing they used to make the fantasy feel rational. Some people don't kill to gain. They kill to become. By day 6, the cracks were showing. Nate was over-explaining in our interviews, filling silences with extra details, circling back to things we hadn't asked about. Cole was doing the opposite, minimal, careful, giving me nothing extra. In separate interviews on the same afternoon, each one subtly contradicted the other on a timeline detail. Neither of them should have gotten wrong. I asked Nate about the notebook, and he said, "I didn't write it." I asked Cole about it, and he said, "We all write things." That same evening, our digital forensics team flagged something in Cole's search history. A query 9 months old, asking how long it takes for blood to dry on wood flooring. We pushed the warrant for cloud backup accounts the next morning. By day 10, the town was restless. There was a vigil at the high school. Media had arrived from the city. My captain was breathing down my neck, and I understood it. A family of 3 was dead, and we had 2 boys who were looking more and more like the answer. But we didn't have what we needed to move yet. I told him we either build the case completely, or we lose it forever. He didn't love that answer. I stood by it. Which is why, when the border alert hit on day 10, when I found out that Nate and Cole had left the state and were in a coastal port city across the Canadian border, I wasn't panicked. I was focused. They'd rented a place under a friend of a friend's name. Thought they were unreachable. I imagined they were watching the case online, following the coverage, maybe even critiquing it the way they critiqued everything else. Coordinating with Canadian law enforcement is its own kind of work, patient, technical, full of careful language about jurisdiction and evidence sharing and what can be used where. But our contact up there was sharp, and about 3 weeks in, she told me something I wrote in my case journal in capital letters. She said they were bragging in the wrong rooms. And then she said something that I keep coming back to even now. If we let them keep talking, they'll talk themselves into a box. There's a technique used by Canadian law enforcement, occasionally cross-border, called a Mr. Big operation. The basic architecture of it is this. Undercover officers build a relationship with the suspect over weeks, small tasks, escalating trust, a fake criminal organization that feels increasingly real. And then, at the end, there's a meeting with the supposed boss of the organization, someone who tells the suspect that law enforcement has forensic threads and timeline problems, and that the only way the organization can protect them is if they understand the full truth. I want to be careful about how I describe what we hoped for, because these operations carry legal risk. Courts have scrutinized them. Confessions obtained this way can be challenged on reliability grounds, and the admissibility often hinges on how much independent corroboration exists. I went into it with one non-negotiable condition. Any admission made in that room had to be matched item by item against evidence we already had or could independently confirm. I wasn't building a case on a taped conversation. I was using the conversation to confirm the case I'd already built. I had the same concern our Canadian contact kept raising, that a confession obtained through relationship and reward and pressure could be challenged, suppressed, thrown out. So I gave the undercover team a list of what I called ep8 corroboration targets, non-public details, specifics about the scene that had never been released, things only the person who was in that house would know. They started with Cole. That was the right call, because Cole didn't want money. He wanted an audience. Over 7 weeks, the undercover operatives built a world for him. Small tasks, earned praise, inside jokes. The feeling of being seen as capable and extraordinary. Exactly what he'd been chasing his whole life. He thrived. Nate followed along because Nate couldn't stand the idea of being the secondary character in Cole's story. The final meeting happened in a rented office. No theatrics. Expensive chairs, the hum of a small refrigerator, neutral walls. The man playing the boss didn't threaten them, he validated them. He told them there were forensic angles the organization had learned about, phone gaps, physical staging, a timeline problem, and that the only way he could make it go away was if he understood the full scope, so he wasn't blindsided. Cole started talking the way some people sing when a spotlight hits them. He didn't sound haunted. He sounded proud. He framed the whole thing as competence. He used the words beats and timing and performance. He described the grief they'd performed at the scene as if it were scene work from a class they'd aced. He talked about the notebook like it was craft. And then he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said, the scene was the best part. The scene was clean. Nate tried to interrupt twice. Both times Cole kept going because Cole had the room and he knew it, and nothing else mattered. The boss pressed on a specific detail, an object that had been moved in the house during staging, something we'd documented in our internal records but never released publicly. Cole described it. He described its original location, where he'd moved it, and why. It matched. Nate started to cry toward the end of the session. And I've seen enough. Tears in enough interview rooms to know the difference between grief and consequence. He wasn't crying for the Mercer family. He was crying because he finally understood there was no version of this where he got to walk away. He said one sentence that the entire room, even the undercover operatives, who were supposed to be stone-faced, felt like a slap. He said it was supposed to be clean. I watched the footage alone the first time. I didn't want anyone else's reaction to contaminate my memory of it. And afterward I wrote a single line in my case journal. They didn't commit a murder. They auditioned for one. The corroboration sprint took 2 weeks. My team went back through every claim in that recorded session and matched it against physical evidence, digital data, forensic reports, and documented scene observations. The timeline gap matched. The staging marks matched. The details about where things were moved and why matched a pattern we'd already independently charted. The purchase history for cleaning supplies and certain other items matched the time frame. A discard location Cole mentioned casually, like it was an afterthought. That matched too. Extradition was its own slow machinery. The cross-border process involves conditions and assurances and ministerial review, and when someone says those last 2 words to you, you learn to pack a bag because you're going to be waiting. In cases involving Canada and the United States, there can be formal requirements around the death penalty, written assurances that it won't be sought, before a person can be transferred. That condition applied here. It added months. At one point during the wait, I received an envelope at the office. No return address. Inside was a single printed page. It was the 911 call, the original call Nate had made the night we arrived at the Mercer house, but rewritten, improved in the sender's estimation, with stage directions in brackets, notes about pacing, suggestions for where to pause for effect. I never proved who sent it. I didn't need to. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense tried every available angle. That the undercover operation had manufactured the confession through manipulation and psychological pressure, that 2 teenagers had been playing out a fantasy and not a real plan, that someone else entirely had committed the murders, and these boys had panicked. Each argument was coherent. Each one ran directly into the wall of physical evidence, forensic data, digital records, and the specific, non-public details Cole had disclosed in that rented office. The prosecution didn't try to make them look like monsters. That wasn't the job. The job was to show the planning, the performance, and the gap between what they told the world and what the evidence showed. The notebook, the device drafts, the staged alibi, the timing, the rehearsals, the recorded admissions that matched what only the person inside that house would know. During closing arguments, one juror, I found out later, passed a note asking if they could see the notebook page again. The one with the bullet points, the one with the word beats at the top. I thought about that a lot afterward. That the thing I couldn't stop looking at was the thing the jury needed to see again, too. They were both convicted, life sentences. Randall and Carla's family sat through the sentencing without making a sound. I stood at the back of the room and watched and tried to find something that felt like resolution. I didn't. After it was over, I went home, sat at my kitchen table, same table where I'd sat the morning after, with the cold coffee, and I opened my case journal. I wrote down the last line I'd add to it. A case is a story you tell to a court, but the dead don't get an ending. People ask me sometimes if the house felt haunted, if there was something there, some presence, some atmosphere that told you something awful had happened. I always give the same answer. No. The house was quiet. The house was ordinary. The horror wasn't in the walls. It was in a spiral notebook on a kitchen counter, open to a page with bullet points, and in 2 boys who had decided, somewhere along the way, in the private language they'd built between them, that empathy was the part of themselves they could cut away and still call themselves extraordinary. Who does that? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Who looks at the people who raised them? At a 15-year-old boy named Owen who just wanted quiet and routine and a sense of safety in his own home, and sees characters. Who practices grief? Who writes it down? I locked the anonymous envelope in the back of my case file, behind the last evidence photograph, behind the property inventory sheet, behind everything. And I haven't opened it since. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I think about that last page, the rewritten 911 call with the stage, directions, the pacing notes, the bracket at the very end of the page in the same careful block lettering. Story 2. I still think about the soil sometimes. I know that sounds like a strange way to start this, but it's the truth. Years after everything happened, I drove back out to that stretch of land 7 miles outside Hollow Creek, just off a logging road the county had half forgotten about. The grass didn't grow right out there. It came up thin and pale and wrong, like the ground itself was sick. I remember crouching down and rubbing a handful of dirt between my fingers. It was dark, dense, too rich. The kind of earth that's been fed something it shouldn't have. I've spent 22 years in law enforcement. I've worked homicides, arsons, missing persons, fraud. I've seen things I won't describe to anyone who hasn't had to see them themselves. But the case I'm about to tell you about, the one that started in a logging valley town in the coastal range of Oregon and ended in a courtroom that couldn't quite find the right word for what had happened, That case is the one that doesn't leave me alone. Not completely. Not even now. Her name was Dr. Nora Aldrich, and she didn't kill anyone with a weapon. She didn't use poison. She didn't even raise her voice. She used hunger, and she convinced her patients that hunger was medicine. I'm Detective Walter Fagan, formerly of the Millstone County Sheriff's Department. I spent the better part of 5 years building the case against a woman who starved people to death and then signed their death certificates herself and buried them on her own property. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened and exactly how it almost didn't get solved at all. It started, like a lot of cases do, not with a body but with a bank. It was October of 1994. I was 41 years old, running on bad coffee and a caseload that hadn't thinned out in 3 months. My partner at the time, a man named Detective Carl Gagnon, had just transferred to the Portland office, which left me short-handed and short-tempered, if I'm being honest. I remember the morning the call came in from First Pacific Savings in Portland. Their fraud investigator, a cautious man named Alan Ingram, had flagged a series of account transfers he described as, and I'm reading directly from my notes here, irregular in pattern and timeline relative to the account holder's last known medical status. The account holder was a woman named Elaine Haas, 53 years old, a retired school teacher from Astoria who had, according to her nephew, traveled to a place called the Cascade Ridge Wellness Retreat in October of 1993, seeking treatment for chronic fatigue and persistent digestive illness. She'd been referred there by a friend who claimed the facility's proprietor had cured her of migraines she'd had for 15 years. What Elaine's nephew, a man named Raymond Eckstein, noticed was that his aunt had transferred $62,000 in 3 separate installments to an account held by the retreat's director over the course of her stay. The last transfers, $28,000 of Duquesne, was dated 11 days before she died. Cause of death, per the death certificate. Ovarian cancer, advanced stage. Raymond's problem with that, which he told me in a voice that kept cracking with barely controlled fury, when he sat across from me at my desk, was that his aunt had undergone a full physical examination at Oregon Health Sciences in Portland 8 months earlier. She'd been told she had iron deficiency anemia and mild irritable bowel syndrome. Nothing that warranted alarm, nothing that remotely suggested cancer. She wasn't sick, Detective, he said. She was tired. She was always tired. She thought this place was going to fix that. She wrote me letters saying she'd never felt so hopeful. I asked him when the letters stopped. He opened his jacket and put a folder on my desk. The last letter was dated 6 weeks before her death. It was shaky. The handwriting barely looked like hers. She wrote that she was having a difficult stretch, but that Dr. Aldrich said difficulty was the sign of healing. She wrote that she trusted the process. That phrase, I trust the process. I've thought about it 1,000 times since. I started pulling records that afternoon. The facility was called Cascade Ridge Wellness Retreat. It sat at the end of a logging road 3 miles outside Hollow Creek, a timber town of about 800 people in the coastal range east of Lincoln City. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on a 2-lane highway that got icy from November through March. The facility itself had been operating since 1989, according to incorporation documents filed with the Oregon Secretary of State. Sole proprietor and medical director, Dr. Nora Aldrich. I contacted the Oregon State Medical Board the next morning. Dr. Nora Aldrich held a naturopathic practitioner's license issued in 1987. She had no MD, no osteopathic degree, no nursing certification. She had listed on her license application that she had trained under a European practitioner in fasting-based restorative medicine during a period she spent in Switzerland in the early 1980s. When I contacted the Swiss naturopathic registries, none of them had any record of her. Behavioral flag number 1, I wrote in my notebook that night. Fraudulent credential claims, unverifiable training, self-issued title. I drove out to Hollow Creek on October 19th, 1994. I went alone the first time because I wanted a low-footprint look at the place before I showed any cards. I told the woman at the front desk I was following up on a referral inquiry. Nora Aldrich herself met me in the main lobby within 10 minutes. That was the first time I saw her. She was 51, tall, angular, with silver hair pulled back in a way that looked deliberate rather than practical. She wore a white coat over dark trousers. Her handshake was firm, and she looked at me directly while she shook it, with the kind of eye contact that doesn't feel warm. It feels like measurement. She smiled, but her eyes weren't in it. I've learned over the years that there are people whose smiles exist in their mouths only. Hers was one of those. She gave me a tour. The facility was clean, spotlessly, unnervingly clean, in a way that felt like effort rather than habit. The main building was a converted lodge with 6 patient rooms on the upper floor. Behind it were a treatment cottage, a small outbuilding she called the Restoration Chapel, and a kitchen that showed no evidence of any cooking. When I asked about meals, Nora smiled that mouth-only smile and explained that Cascade Ridge practiced therapeutic fasting, meaning patients consumed only specific nutrient broths and herbal preparations calibrated to their detoxification stage. All disease, she told me, originates in the body's accumulated toxicity from food. The only path to genuine healing is to stop feeding the illness and allow the body to consume what doesn't serve it. I asked her what that looked like practically. She handed me a printed protocol. Patients progress through 4 stages. The transition phase, reduced solid food. The active elimination phase, broth only, daily colonic treatments. The purification phase, water and herbal preparations, twice daily colonics. And the restoration phase, gradual reintroduction of minimal foods. Average program length, she said, was 8 to 14 weeks. I asked to see patient treatment logs. She complied without hesitation. And that was something I noticed. Most people running operations they know to be fraudulent get defensive when you ask for paperwork. She didn't. She brought me a binder that was meticulous. Daily weight measurements, symptom notation, elimination progress, broth quantities, everything neat, organized, coded. The documentation of a person who believed, genuinely and completely, in what she was doing. There were currently 3 patients at the facility. She introduced me to 2 of them. The one that stayed with me was a woman named June Cabrera, 44 years old, originally from Portland. She had come to Cascade Ridge 6 weeks earlier, seeking treatment for what her intake form described as chronic autoimmune fatigue and systemic inflammation. She sat in a chair by the window of her room, and she was, by my estimate, barely 90 pounds. Her skin had the gray-yellow cast of malnutrition. Her hands shook when she lifted her water glass. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a person conserving every calorie of energy. She told me she felt lighter. She told me the difficulty of the first 2 weeks had been a purification crisis, and that she was through the worst of it. She told me Dr. Aldrich was the first practitioner who had ever truly understood her illness. I asked her when she had last eaten solid food. She paused for a long time. Then she said she didn't remember exactly, and that Dr. Aldrich would tell her when she was ready. I walked out of that, Facility knowing two things with complete certainty. 1. Nora Aldrich was systematically starving the people who trusted her. 2. I had absolutely nothing I could prove. Yet, I spent November building the financial picture with the help of Alan Ingram at First Pacific Savings and a forensic accountant the state AG's office lent me named Barry Calderon. What we found was consistent across 9 patient files spanning 6 years of operation. The pattern was identical every time. Patient arrived with a chronic but non-terminal condition, fatigue, digestive complaints, migraines, fibromyalgia. Patient was encouraged to sever contact with family during the intensive elimination phase to avoid what Nora called external toxin transmission. Patient's condition deteriorated over weeks. Patient executed a new will or transferred significant assets, sometimes as a treatment fee, sometimes as a gratitude donation, during the later stages of their stay, when records showed them at their lowest documented weights. Patient died. Nora signed the death certificate. Nora performed what she called a confirmatory post-mortem examination. Body was cremated or buried in the small private plot behind the facility. 14 patients admitted between 1989 and 1994. 9 deaths. Total financial transfers to Nora Aldrich and the retreat's associated account, $188,000. Barry laid it all out on a table in my office one rainy December afternoon, and we both just looked at it for a while. "This isn't alternative medicine," he said finally. "No," I said, "it isn't." What I needed was a family member who wouldn't accept the explanation. I needed someone with resources and determination and a specific reason to doubt the narrative Nora had constructed around a death. I got that person on February 3rd, 1995, when a woman named Diane Farrell walked into my office. Diane's sister, a woman named Carol Farrell, had been a patient at Cascade Ridge from August through November of 1994. Carol was 36 years old and had traveled from Seattle after a friend recommended the retreat for help with chronic migraines that conventional medicine hadn't resolved. In August, Carol's letters home were optimistic. By October, the letters had changed. Diane handed me copies she'd kept in a shoebox. The October 12th letter said Carol was very tired but trusting the process. The October 28th letter said the fasting was harder than expected. The November 7th letter was barely a paragraph, written in a script so shaky it was almost illegible. It said she thought she'd made a mistake and that she wanted to come home, but that Dr. Aldrich had told her leaving now would be dangerous. The November 7th letter was the last one. On November 22nd, Diane received a phone call from Nora Aldrich informing her that Carol had died 2 days prior. Heart failure, secondary to previously undiagnosed congenital cardiac disease. Diane drove to Hollow Creek the following day. She asked to see her sister's body. Nora told her Carol had already been cremated per her own written wishes. Diane told me, sitting across from my desk with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white, that her sister was not the kind of person who would choose cremation. They were Methodist. Their entire family was Methodist. Carol had never, in 36 years, expressed any preference for cremation. Their mother was buried in a churchyard in Tacoma, and Carol had told Diane, after their mother's funeral, that she wanted to be buried in the same place someday. Diane also told me that Nora had shown her a handwritten document dated November 8th, the day after Carol's last letter, stating that Carol wished to be cremated and was donating $14,000 to Cascade Ridge in deep appreciation for Dr. Aldrich's extraordinary care. The handwriting was Carol's. "She was dying when she signed that," Diane said. "I know it. She couldn't even write a full paragraph on November 7th. On November 8th, she's signing a will donation." I looked at Diane Farrell for a moment. Then I wrote in my notebook, "This is the break." We exhumed Elaine Haas's body on March 4th, 1995. She had been buried, not cremated, one of only 3 of Nora's patients who had been buried rather than cremated, presumably because cremation requests from family had been too insistent to override without raising suspicion. The exhumation site was the small private plot behind Cascade Ridge. There were 7 marked graves. No external headstones, just small flat markers with initials and dates. The state medical examiner, a thorough and unflappable man named Dr. Fred Waldron, performed the autopsy. His findings were delivered in writing 10 days later, and I've read them so many times over the years I could recite them. Elaine Haas had died of starvation-induced multi-organ failure. At death, she had weighed an estimated 68 pounds. There was extreme muscle wasting consistent with prolonged caloric deprivation. Her liver showed fatty degeneration. Her gastric contents contained only trace vegetable matter. There was chronic rectal trauma consistent with repeated high-volume enema procedures. There was no pathological evidence of ovarian cancer. There was no evidence of any cancer at all. Waldron's conclusion: this individual did not die of malignant disease. She died of starvation. The degree of emaciation and organ atrophy is consistent with weeks of severe caloric restriction. This death was caused by imposed fasting, not natural disease. I read that line in my car in the parking lot of the medical examiner's building, and I sat there for a long time with the engine off. We executed the search warrant on March 11th, 1995, the Restoration Chapel. I don't talk about what we found in that room very much. I'll tell you the facts, plainly. There was a porcelain bathtub positioned in the center of the room. There were surgical instruments, a bone saw, scalpels, rib spreaders, tissue forceps, all showing evidence of use. There were 11 handwritten autopsy reports in Nora's handwriting, documenting post-mortem examinations of 11 individuals. There were cremation containers labeled with initials. There were patient wills and financial transfer documents, many signed in handwriting that shook. In a locked drawer beneath the examination table, we found her personal journal. I need to read you the entry dated November 24th, 1994. I've memorized it because I've read it hundreds of times. She wrote, "E.H. expired early this morning. Process was textbook. Initial resistance, psychological surrender, physiological collapse. Nephew has already contacted legal regarding state transfer. Total yield, $28,000. Post-mortem examination confirmed. Classic starvation morphology. Cause of death documented as ovarian carcinoma to avoid external inquiry. Cremation will proceed tomorrow." She documented it. Every death, every transfer, every lie she wrote on every death certificate. She didn't think she was committing murder. She thought she was conducting research. Her patients were subjects to her. Their deaths were data points. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about as I stood in that room in the cold March light. Not that she was greedy. Plenty of fraudsters are greedy. But Nora Aldrich genuinely believed she was right. She killed 14 people over 6 years, and she wrote it all down with the calm, careful handwriting of a woman who was certain of her methods. A psychiatrist from Portland named Dr. Carl Hannigan, who I worked with over the following months to build Nora's psychological profile, described what she exhibited as a combination of pathological narcissism and delusional conviction. She needed to be the sole authority over her patients' bodies and lives. She had found a method that achieved that by targeting the one thing every human being has in common, the need to eat. By pathologizing hunger, she turned her patients' survival instincts into symptoms requiring her intervention. And once patients were cognitively weakened by weeks of severe caloric restriction, they were no longer capable of reasoning their way out of the situation even when part of them wanted to. She didn't drag people into her facility, Hannigan said. They came to her, they paid her, they thanked her, and even as they starved, many of them defended her. That's the psychology of coercive dependency. It's easier to believe the pain has meaning than to admit you've been exploited. The case went to trial in January 1996. I testified for 7 days. The prosecution had overwhelming physical evidence. We had Waldron's autopsy findings. We had the journal. We had the financial records. We had the falsified death certificates. What we could not definitively prove to the jury's satisfaction was intent to kill. Nora's defense attorney, a composed and skilled man named Graham Pierce, built his entire case around a single argument. Dr. Aldrich genuinely believed in her treatment methods. She did not intend harm. She was a practitioner of an alternative medical philosophy, and her patients had consented to fasting protocols of their own free will. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. They came back with guilty on 5 counts. Not first-degree murder, not second-degree murder, but voluntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced her to 8 to 20 years. I wrote in my notebook that night, manslaughter? She starved 14 people, forged their death certificates, took their money, buried them in her back field, and the law calls it manslaughter. I know the evidence was solid. I know the prosecutor did everything that could be done. But intent is a shadow. Nora never said, I will kill this person. She said, I will cure this person. And then she let them die. In the eyes of the law, that's a different crime. She served 4 years. Prison overcrowding, good behavior. She was released in the spring of 2000. In 2004, I received an anonymous tip from a woman in a small town near the Idaho border. There was a new facility there, a new name on the paperwork, Dr. Nina Bauer. The advertising was almost word for word identical to Cascade Ridge's old brochures. Natural restoration, the purifying fast, decades of accumulated toxicity cleansed at the cellular level. I sent warnings to the local sheriff, to the state medical board, to the county health department. I sent copies of Nora Aldrich's conviction records. The county health department sent an inspector who found no immediate violations. Nobody stopped her. She died in March 2008 at age 65. I received a note from a county coroner in northern Idaho who'd seen my name in the old Oregon case files. Cause of death, multi-organ failure. She'd been fasting herself. She'd diagnosed herself with what she described in a personal journal as systemic toxemia and had begun a self-administered purification protocol in January. She starved herself to death. She died the same way her patients did. Alone, hungry, convinced it was medicine. I've never told a lot of people about this case. I don't know why, exactly. It's not that I think nobody would believe me. The records are real. The conviction was real. I think it's because there's something about it that resists the kind of clean narrative people want from a case. She wasn't a monster in the way that word usually gets used. She didn't sneak up on anyone in the dark. She smiled and she offered hope, and she handed you a brochure, and she told you that the thing that hurt was actually the thing that was healing you, And people believed her. Desperate people, sick people, people who'd tried everything else and found nothing. She found them exactly where they were most vulnerable. And she offered them the thing they most needed: certainty. An authority who knew what was wrong and had the answer. I still drive out to that patch of land sometimes when I find myself out that way. The soil is still wrong. It's been 30 years and it still comes up thin and pale, like something in the ground hasn't recovered. I don't know how to explain that. Maybe I don't need to. What I do know is this: the hunger she exploited didn't belong to her patients. It belongs to all of us. The hunger for healing, for answers, for someone who speaks with enough confidence that you stop asking questions. That hunger is real and it's legitimate, and it doesn't make the people who trusted her foolish. It makes them human. But there are people out there, different methods, different names, different promises, running the same operation on that same human need. Find the desperate, offer certainty, control the information, profit from the harm. That case never really closes. Because the thing it was built on, that hunger, never dies. It just finds new doctors. Story 3. I keep a storage unit about 3 miles from my house, 42 boxes. All of them labeled, all of them organized, all of them technically belonging to a department that closed the active file years before I retired. But nobody ever asked for them back. And I never volunteered to give them up. Box 17 holds a single evidence bag. Inside is a clarinet mouthpiece with teeth marks pressed into the rubber so deep you can almost hear the music that was never finished. Box 29 is filled with black garbage bags. The same brand, the same thickness, the same factory seal as the ones pulled from a river on a Tuesday morning in July 1989. And sitting at the bottom of Box 1, folded twice and paper-clipped to a manila envelope, is a voice stress analysis printout that marked deception on every single question, except one. Do you think about them? The answer was yes. My name is Detective Neil Carver. I spent 9 years of my career, and honestly the rest of my life, trying to build a case against a man I could see, talk to, watch, and study, but never touch. He moved through our small mountain town the way fog moves through a stage set, visible, everywhere, and utterly impossible to hold. He shook hands at community fundraisers. He fixed lighting rigs and painted set pieces. He smiled at the families of people he had killed. And he never spent a single night in a cell. This is the story of what we called the curtain call murders. I want you to understand something before I go any further. When I use the word "no" in the story, I'm not speaking as a law enforcement officer bound by evidence standards. I'm speaking as a human being who spent a decade looking into the face of evil and being told, politely but firmly, that evil isn't enough, that you need fibers, fingerprints, DNA, a witness, a body, something you can hold up in a courtroom and say, here is the thing that proves it. We never had that, not once. And he knew it. That's the thing that will keep me awake until the day I die. It started on a Saturday afternoon in April 1987. The Coyle County Fair came to Silver Pine Ridge every spring. And that year was no different. Game booths, food vendors, carnival rides, the usual noise and color that drew every family in the valley out of the house. It was the kind of day that felt safe in the way that small towns feel safe. Everyone knew everyone. Kids ran loose. Parents sat on bleachers and talked about the weather and the upcoming high school sports season. Cassie Monroe was 12 years old that afternoon. Red hair, gap-toothed grin, the kind of kid who could charm a discount out of a carnival vendor just by smiling. She'd gone to the fair with a friend, and sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon, she called her mother from her friend's house near the fairgrounds, complaining of nausea. Her mother, no car that day, no easy way to come get her, told her to rest with a cold cloth and come home when she felt better. Cassie said, okay. Cassie never called back. Her mother assumed she'd recovered. Kids bounce back fast. That's what parents tell themselves when they need to believe the world is still ordinary. By nightfall, though, the world had stopped being ordinary. The missing persons report was filed just before 1 a.m. on April 15th. I caught the case the next morning. The initial search felt routine, if that word can ever apply to a missing 12-year-old. We canvassed the fairgrounds and the surrounding streets. We interviewed vendors, neighbors, fairground workers, every carnival operator with a booth. We got fragments. A white 10-speed bicycle, leaning against a fence at the edge of the ground, not dropped, not tipped over, but set there neatly, like someone had carefully parked it. A single red leather tennis shoe found in tall grass about 200 yards away, no second shoe, no sign of struggle, and 3 separate witness statements from 3 completely unrelated people describing a polite man with a camera who had been photographing children near the game booths earlier that afternoon. One of those witnesses was an older woman who'd been running a lemonade stand. She remembered him specifically because he'd come to her and asked for a clean washcloth, explaining that a young girl nearby wasn't feeling well. She described him as clean-cut, calm, maybe in his mid-30s, with an easy way of talking that made her think he was a doctor or a teacher. She gave him the washcloth without a second thought. I wrote in my journal that night, 12-year-olds don't vanish from county fairs in daylight without screaming. Either Cassie knew her abductor, or he presented himself in a way that completely disarmed her. The bicycle bothered me. The placement was too careful, too deliberate, like something left as a marker rather than dropped in panic. The shoe bothered me more. The washcloth led us back to the friend's family, and the friend's mother mentioned her boyfriend. A man named Dale Sutton, 34 years old, who worked as a freelance stagehand and theater technician in and around Silver Pine Ridge. He'd been at the house briefly that afternoon. He'd given Cassie the washcloth before she left. When we brought Sutton in for a voluntary interview, I met him for the first time. I want to be careful how I describe that meeting, because I've spent decades thinking about it, and I still don't fully trust my own memory of it. What I can tell you is that he was cooperative, articulate, and calm in a way that didn't sit right with me. He admitted giving her the cloth. He said he hadn't seen her leave. He volunteered, without being asked, that he'd been at the fairgrounds earlier in the day taking photographs for what he called a personal project, but claimed he'd left by 1 p.m. We asked if he'd submit to a polygraph. He declined politely. He said he didn't trust the technology. Now, declining a polygraph isn't evidence of guilt. Most defense attorneys will tell you to decline. I knew that then, and I know it now. But there were other things in that interview that burrowed into my brain and stayed there. He smiled when he described Cassie as a sweet kid, very trusting. He used past tense when referring to her. Before we'd confirmed she was dead, before we'd confirmed anything at all beyond the fact that she was missing. When I asked about his relationship with the family, he leaned back and crossed his arms. When I asked about the fairgrounds, he leaned forward. Small things, nothing admissible. But I've been in this job long enough to know when something small is pointing at something large. We ran his background. In 1980, Dale Sutton, then 27, living in Portland, Oregon, had been arrested for attempted burglary near a mortuary. The mortuary at the time contained the bodies of 2 women who had drowned in a boating accident. At the time of arrest, Sutton was found in possession of a utility knife, a flashlight, and a 35mm camera with a telephoto lens. He had no explanation for his presence. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of trespassing, completed his probation, and moved to Montana 2 years later. I drove to Portland and met the detective who'd handled the case, retired by then, living in a house that smelled like coffee and old newspapers. He told me, "We knew he wasn't there to steal anything. He was there to photograph them. We just couldn't prove it. 6 weeks after Cassie Monroe's disappearance, we stopped finding even fragments. Dive teams swept the Coil River. Cadaver dogs covered 40 square miles of forest, ravines, creek beds, and open ground. Volunteers walked grid patterns until the soles of their boots wore through. We found nothing. Cassie Monroe's body has never been recovered. I dream about the washcloth sometimes. In the dream, Sutton hands it to her, and when she reaches out to take it, her hands disappear. I wake up knowing 2 things: that he had killed before, and that he would kill again. I was right. June 20th, 1989. 2 years and 2 months after Cassie Monroe vanished from the county fair. A young woman named Blythe Baldwin was 24 years old, a graduate student in broadcast journalism at a university about 50 miles north of Silver Pine Ridge. Athletic, ambitious, the kind of person who turns heads in a room, not because of how she looked, but because of how she moved through space, like she was always going somewhere worth going. On that June morning, she decided to bicycle 47 miles south along Highway 14 to visit family in Silver Pine Ridge. It was a route she'd taken before. She knew it well. Her last confirmed sighting was at 11:20 a.m., near mile marker 33 on Highway 14. A passing motorist reported seeing a young woman on a blue 10-speed bicycle, speaking with a man in a dark brown van with yellow commercial plates and black lettering on the side. The van was parked on the shoulder. The man was leaning out the driver's window. The motorist said the interaction looked normal, like they knew each other. He drove past. He didn't stop. He didn't get a plate number. Blythe never arrived in Silver Pine Ridge. On July 2nd, at 6:45 in the morning, a fisherman named Grant Calloway was working the shallows near Red Wolf Crossing Bridge when his line snagged something heavy in the water. He pulled up a black garbage bag sealed with duct tape. Inside was a human leg. By noon, our dive team had recovered 6 additional bags from the Coil River. I won't walk through every detail of what was inside each bag. I don't think that serves anyone. What I will tell you is that Blythe Baldwin was identified through dental records, that the medical examiner determined she had been dismembered post-mortem with a fine tooth saw, with cuts made precisely at the joints, the kind of precision that suggested either a familiarity with anatomy or a long experience with tools that required clean, measured cutting, and that the head was never found. One of the bags had been wrapped in old newspaper, an issue of the Silver Pine Tribune from April of that same year. The psychological profile we requested from the FBI noted that the use of old newspaper, stockpiled, stored, retrieved, suggested planning rather than panic, suggested someone who had prepared the materials in advance and kept them on hand. Blythe Baldwin had worked part-time at the Silver Pine Civic Playhouse during her undergraduate years as a production assistant and lighting technician. She'd left the job the previous year, but still attended performances and kept up friendships with the people in the theater community. Dale Sutton had been a stagehand and set designer at the Playhouse since 1985. He knew her. When we brought him in on July 8, 1989, he expressed what he called deep sadness and offered nothing useful. He claimed he'd been working a delivery route for a local catering company on the day Blythe disappeared. He said he hadn't seen her in months. We subpoenaed his work records. The delivery route he described would have taken him directly past mile marker 33 on Highway 14, at the exact window during which Blythe was last seen. And the catering company provided drivers with commercial vans for large deliveries, brown ones, with the company name in black lettering on the sides, yellow plates. I brought him in again on July 15th. This time I didn't ask him about Blythe. I asked him about the van. He said the company vans were brown, maybe tan. He said they had the company logo on the sides. When I asked about the license plates, he paused longer than any innocent person pauses before answering a simple question. He said he didn't remember. He said he didn't pay attention to that kind of thing. I told him a witness had seen a young woman matching Blythe's description, talking to a man in a brown van with yellow plates near mile marker 33 on the day she disappeared, and that he had been driving that route that day. He leaned back. He folded his arms. He said he saw a lot of people on the road, and he didn't remember. I asked again about the polygraph. He asked if he needed a lawyer. He stopped talking to us after that. His attorney made sure of it. But before counsel arrived that day, we administered a voice stress analysis. It showed deception on every question about his whereabouts, about whether he'd seen Blythe that day, about whether he knew what happened to her. No deception on one question only. Do you think about her? His answer was yes. He said he thought about all of them. At the time, I took that as a slip, a fragment of a confession wrapped in ambiguity. I still think it was, but ambiguity doesn't hold up in court, and Sutton knew exactly how much weight that sentence could and couldn't carry. September 14th, 1990, a Saturday night. The Silver Pines Civic Playhouse was hosting a retirement party for its longtime director, a beloved figure who had run the theater for nearly 30 years. The building was full. Cast members, volunteers, community donors, old friends, people who'd built sets and sewn costumes and run light boards for 3 decades in that place. It was the kind of evening that felt like a celebration, like a community exhaling all at once. 3 people left that building and were never seen again. The first was a man named Colt Hadley, 37 years old. He was the theater's janitor and maintenance supervisor, a quiet, well-liked man who also played clarinet, mostly jazz, mostly late at night in the empty building when no one else was around. He'd been at the party, but left early, asking some friends to drop him at the playhouse so he could run a load of laundry in the basement machines and get some practice in. His girlfriend, Wendy Foss, watched him unlock the side door, flip on the hallway light, and walk inside. That was the last confirmed sighting. The second was a young woman named Judith Cray, 22 years old. She'd worked as the playhouse janitor before Colt took over the role in 1989 and had since moved into assistant stage management. She was close friends with Colt and had come to the retirement party. When it wound down around 11 p.m., she and her stepsister decided to walk to a grocery store 3 blocks away to pick up some snacks. The stepsister's name was Paige Lorne. She was 19, visiting from out of state. She had no connection to the theater at all. She'd only come that night as Judith's guest. A bartender at a pub across the street saw both women on the sidewalk at around 11:20 p.m., heading toward the grocery store. A driver stopped at a red light saw them near the playhouse's rear alley entrance, speaking with someone in the shadows. Nobody saw them reach the store. At 7:30 the next morning, Wendy Foss called the station. Colt hadn't come home. His car was still in the Playhouse parking lot. The side door was unlocked. Arrived at 8:05 a.m. The building was pristine. Lights off, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing obviously out of place. In the basement laundry room, I found Colt Hadley's clarinet in its open case, the mouthpiece removed and set carefully on top of the dryer. There was no laundry anywhere, no dirty clothes, no basket, nothing in the machines. The room smelled faintly of something chemical, almost medicinal. I couldn't identify it then. I still can't. On the stage upstairs, there was a half-assembled set piece for an upcoming production with tools arranged neatly beside it. A clipboard with a task list on it, written in Dale Sutton's handwriting, and behind one of the curtains, folded flat and tucked against the wall, a single black garbage bag. Empty. The clarinet had been placed, not dropped. The mouthpiece had been removed and set down deliberately. Colt wouldn't have done that in the middle of playing. Someone else had been in that room. Someone else had moved through it with time and control and no apparent hurry. The missing laundry. I came back to that detail 100 times. If he'd come there to do laundry, where was it? If he hadn't, why use that as the reason for going? It's the detail that still keeps me awake. Judith's roommate reported her and Paige missing at 2 p.m. the following day. K-9 units tracked Judith's scent from her apartment to the Playhouse rear alley, and then the trail ended. As if both women had simply stepped off the edge of the world at the back of a theater building on a Saturday night, while the rest of the town slept. We searched the surrounding area for 6 days. No belongings, no blood, no physical evidence from the alley or anything near it. Luminol testing inside the Playhouse proved inconclusive. The lead-based paint on the stage floor and walls interfered with the reaction, which felt almost cosmically unfair given everything else. 18 months later, in March 1992, 2 hikers found skeletal remains in a forested ravine 35 miles south of Silver Pine Ridge. 2 bodies, both female, partial skeletons only. Weather and animals had scattered the remains across a wide area. Dental records identified them as Judith Cray and Paige Lorne. The cause of Judith's death could not be determined from the skeletal evidence remaining. Paige Lorne had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, fracture patterns consistent with a hammer or similar tool. Rope fragments were found near both bodies. Forensic analysis matched the rope to theatrical rigging supplies used at the Silver Pine Civic Playhouse, the specific type, the specific manufacturer, the kind of rope that Dale Sutton handled as a matter of routine. Colt Hadley's body has never been found. By late 1990, every investigative thread we had, every witness statement, every vehicle record, every behavioral analysis, every piece of circumstantial material led back to Dale Sutton. He had connections to all 5 victims. He had been present at or near the locations where each one disappeared. He had a prior arrest that, in hindsight, was a textbook preview of exactly the kind of pathology we were looking at. He matched witness descriptions in multiple cases. He had access to the vehicles, the tools, the buildings, and the materials consistent with every crime. What we didn't have was proof. No physical evidence directly linking him to any crime scene. No DNA. This was 1990, and forensic DNA technology was still in its early stages. We had no biological samples from Sutton to compare against anything. No witness who could put him with any victim at the moment of their disappearance. No primary crime scene. We never found where any of the murders actually occurred, which meant no blood, no hair, no fiber evidence, no footprints, nothing that could anchor him to the act itself. His alibi for the night of September 14th came from his wife at the time, a woman named Laura Dunning. She said he'd arrived home around 10:30 that evening and hadn't left again until the following morning. We interviewed her 6 times. Her story never changed by a single detail. She divorced him in 1995. A few years after that, she spoke to a private investigator hired by the victims' families. She told him she had lied. She said Sutton had told her exactly what to say, and that she had said it because she was afraid of him. She said she didn't know where he had been that night. By then, the evidentiary windows had closed. The years had done what years do. In June 1991, Dale Sutton packed his belongings and moved to a coastal town in British Columbia, citing a fresh start and what he called small-town gossip, making ordinary life impossible. He has lived there ever since. He has never been charged with any crime connected to the curtain call murders. Cross-border extradition requires physical evidence strong enough to support prosecution. Without a body definitively connected to him, without DNA, without a primary crime scene, the prosecutors declined. Canadian authorities looked at him independently in the mid-1990s after several suspicious incidents involving women in the area where he'd settled. No charges were filed. In 1994, after Laura Dunning gave us access to belongings Sutton had left behind in a rented storage unit, we found things that made me sit down on the concrete floor of that unit and not move for about 10 minutes. A photo album containing over 200 photographs of women and girls in public places, parks, fairs, theater lobbies. None of them appeared to know they were being photographed. A collection of newspaper clippings covering all 5 disappearances, annotated in the margins with commentary on police statements and media coverage. Critiques, really, written in careful, measured handwriting that expressed something between amusement and contempt, and a journal. The journal entries were written in third person. They described a man who understands what others don't see. They never explicitly confessed to anything, but they described hypothetical scenarios in careful, considered detail that mirrored the known facts of each case with a specificity that made my hands shake. One entry, dated September 20th, 1990, 5 days after 3 people vanished from a theater building, read, in part, that the theater was the only honest place, that everywhere else people pretend they are not performing, but in the theater the performance is the point, that what happens in the space between performances is where truth lives, that some actors never leave the stage, that they become part of the set. Forensic linguists confirmed the writing style matched letters Sutton had written to the Playhouse. Bored. Literary analysis, they said, pointing at authorship. Literary analysis isn't evidence of murder. Between 1988 and 1991, Sutton placed over 40 classified ads in regional papers. The ads sought models for what he called artistic photography projects and volunteers for experimental theater workshops. We traced responses to some of them. 12 women had contacted him. 8 declined to meet after the initial phone call. They described him as odd, too focused on whether they'd be alone. 3 met him in public and walked away uncomfortable. One woman, a 26-year-old named Amy Strand, went to a rented studio session in April 1989. She told me in 1992 that Sutton had asked her to lie on a table covered in black plastic and pretend to be asleep or dead. She said he didn't touch her. He didn't threaten her. But when she was lying on that table, she said, the way he looked at her, it was like she wasn't a person. She was a thing he was arranging. She left and never returned his calls. 3 months later, Blythe Baldwin disappeared on Highway 14. The FBI consulted with us in 1992 and produced a behavioral analysis that I've read so many times I could recite it. The profiler noted that Sutton's victim selection wasn't random. All 5 victims were vulnerable in specific situational ways, isolated and accessible, and connected to environments Sutton frequented or controlled. His legitimate roles, stagehand, delivery driver, theater technician, functioned as camouflage. They gave him reason to be anywhere, talking to anyone, at any hour, without raising suspicion. The care taken in Blythe Baldwin's dismemberment and body placement suggested he viewed the crimes as projects rather than impulses. Each disposal had been staged. The profiler used that exact word, staged. Like a production he had designed and executed and reviewed afterward. His post-crime behavior was consistent with a particular kind of predator. One who stays in the community after the act, who participates in searches, attends vigils, engages with investigators, not because he's careless, but because the observation of the aftermath is part of the experience for him. The investigation itself is something he consumes. He sat across from me in that interview room and watched me try to build a case against him. And I genuinely believe, that he enjoyed every second of it. Since 1995, Sutton has sent me 17 letters. They arrive every year or two, postmarked from the town on the coast where he retired. They are never threatening. They are never confessions. They are reviews. The 4th one, which I received in August 2001, referred to a newspaper article marking the 10th anniversary of the case. It noted that the writer had described me as haunted by the unsolved murders, and said it found that word choice fascinating. It said that to be haunted is to be inhabited by something you cannot touch. It asked whether I thought about the victims as they were, or as I imagined they became. It said that theater teaches us every performance is an interpretation, and it asked me which one I was, the audience or the actor. I have never responded. I want to be honest with you about something. I know that in true crime, the audience expects resolution. They expect the case to crack, the DNA match, the deathbed confession, the cold case detective who walks into a courtroom 20 years later with the one piece of evidence that changes everything. That's the story we've been trained to expect. That's not this story. I can tell you what I know. I can tell you that Dale Sutton killed 5 people. I know it in the way I know my own name. I know it in the accumulated weight of 9 years of investigation, in the behavioral analysis, in the witness statements that form a shape, even if none of them individually proves a single thing. I know it in the voice stress analysis that showed deception on every question, except that one. I know it in a journal entry written 5 days after 3 people vanished, describing what happens in the space between performances. I cannot prove it. That distinction between knowing and proving is the thing the law is built on, and it is the thing that allowed a man who killed 5 people to live freely for 35 years, sending letters to the detective who couldn't stop him, sending letters that are perfectly designed to communicate everything without admitting anything. In 2003, Cassie, Monroe's mother, pulled me aside at an anniversary vigil. She said she didn't want to know how her daughter had died. She said she just wanted to know where she was. She wanted to bring her home. We never could. People ask sometimes whether the Silver Pine Civic Playhouse is haunted. There's a local rumor that you can hear clarinet music in the empty building at night. Some people say it's Colt Hadley still practicing in the basement. I've been inside that building more times than I can count since 1990. I've never heard a clarinet. What I hear is silence, the particular kind of silence that fills a theater After the audience has left, and the lights have gone dark, and the stage is empty and still. I retired in 2015. I am 68 years old. Dale Sutton is 73 and still alive and living on a coast that is technically on the other side of a national border, from where his victims' families still grieve. I keep box 17 in my garage. The clarinet mouthpiece is still in there. I can see the teeth marks in the rubber when I open the bag. I think about what Colt Hadley was doing in the moment before whatever happened to him happened. I think about the music stopping. I think about the building going quiet. That's the image I carry with me. Not the river, not the bags, not the ravine. The moment just before, when a person still believes the world makes sense. Dale Sutton stole that moment from 5 people. And the real horror isn't the bodies in the river or the bones in the ravine or the photographs he took when no one was looking. The real horror is that he understood something most people never have to learn. That if you are patient enough, careful enough, and cold enough, you can move through the world doing monstrous things and never pay for them. Because the law doesn't care what you know. It cares what you can prove. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, a man kills 5 people and watches the investigation from the inside and sends letters to the detective afterward and dies of old age surrounded by neighbors who thought he was just quiet and polite and a little unusual. That's the haunting, not the ghost of a clarinet player in an empty theater. The haunting is the man who's still alive,